Now, this section basically deals with the determination of the ancestry. Now, determination of the ancestry is the mainstay whenever we find a dead body that is unidentified and it's lying basically unidentified and sent back to the forensic experts for its identification. It can be a recent dead body, it can be a fresher dead body, and even we can get a more skeletalized, a more decomposed dead body with all the clothes stuck to it. And it's very difficult to identify even from the facial appearances what is the ancestry. So the ancestry is basically the mainstay of the identification for any dead body. Now, in this section, we'll be dealing with the ancestry determination from the skull. Now, the skull and the facial appearances are, of course, the mainstay whenever we want to identify anyone. But in this section specifically, we'll be dealing with the ancestry in with special importance. Now, the determination of the nasal index is very important whenever we are talking about the ancestry, and the determination from the orbital openings and the femur. It is also very important, and it basically we have three ancestral groups, and they have their own significant orbital openings, nasal indices, and the femoral indices as well. So that is the mainstay for this section, and we'll be discussing that in detail in this section. Now, the determination of the ancestry from the skeletal remains. First of all, we have to identify what basically the person who is the descendant from what ancestrals. As I've already told you, we are talking about three main groups: the Caucasians, the Mongoloid, and then we have the Negroid group. So we have to identify in general which group the person we are identifying is from, mainly on a general look. It is difficult determination to make, and facial bones are most important, and they are basically the mainstay whenever we want to get back to the ancestry of any unidentified body. So this is basically a skull, as you already know, and here we have the orbital openings, first of all, and then we have the nasal aperture. The teeth, they are also very important, and they have their own ancestral importances as well whenever we are identifying those. Then, of course, the mandible. We'll be discussing all of these one by one, and the nasal aperture as well. So these are basically the four main indices, the major indices that we'll be discussing for the determination of the ancestry of any skeletal remains. Here we are talking about, we're sticking to the subject whenever we get a body which is in a skeletalized mode, not along with the soft tissues and with the fresher parts. That is a much easier job to do. So the ancestry determination of the skull. Now, the Negroid, this is basically the four groups that we will be discussing in detail. The Negroid, which is basically the African skull. Then we have the Mongoloid, or which is also known as the Asian skull. And the Aboriginal, it's the Australian skull, and the Caucasian or the European skull. So here you can see in general that the Caucasian and the Mongoloid have a lot of resemblance. So it is sometimes very difficult to basically the Mongoloid or the Asian. So it is sometimes very difficult to distinguish whether it is an Asian skull or whether it is a Caucasian skull. But still we have to do it, and we have to stick to the indices, the nasal indices, the femoral indices, and all these skull indices in general, whenever we have to identify what's the ancestry for this skull. So the nasal bone. The nasal bone is very important. The nasal indices are very important. Measure the nasal width. So the nasal width is measured in general. And these are basically the indices. This is a diagram which is showing the cartilage of the septum. And then we have the soft cartilaginous part, but the bony remnants are the mainstay whenever we are going to identify the ancestry of the person. We have a portion of the nasal bone, and then the frontal process of the maxilla is over here, and then we have the fibro-fatty tissue lying over here. So all of these basically forms the nasal indices, but what are important for the ancestral determination? This is basically the nasal width. And moving on, we also have a lot of significance for the nasal height. So in the Mongoloid characteristics, the nasal height is slightly it's slightly lowered, and so in the nasal width, it's slightly more in the mongoloids whenever we are discussing those. So the nasal width is divided by the nasal height, and that basically gives us the nasal index for the ancestral determination. This is the formula for determining the nasal index. This is very important, and then we'll have to put these formulas in a lot of tables that have been devised for the ancestral determination. Now for the Caucasians. Whenever we put all of these indices, the nasal width is there, the nasal height, we get the nasal index, and if it is less than 48, the skull is more or less Caucasian. And if the value lies between 48 to 53, then the skull is Mongoloid, or it can also be Asian. And if it is more than 53, the value is more than 53, the skull is Negroid, or it is also known as the African skull. So this is quite of an importance. If we have got a whole skull and we have all these indices on our hand, we can easily get to the ancestral determination. Now the nasal index measurement, using the inside measurement, and the inside measurements are also noted down, the measurement from the inside of the nasal spine to the inside of the suture line of the nasal bones. So the nasal spine in the Caucasians is more prominent, and in the Mongoloids it is somewhat prominent. In the Negroids it's not prominent at all. We are talking about the nasal spine over here. So the nasal silling and guttering, here we have comparison between all of these. The nasal bridges are basically the nasal pointiness and the nostril breadth. So it's basically a comparison between the old age, the European, and the modern humans. So there are some basically, this is more of an archaeological importance rather than of the forensic importance. Whenever we get our hands on some bones, on skulls, we also have to determine what era these bones belong to basically. So nasal silling and guttering is quite different. Feel the base of the nasal cavity on either side of the nasal spine. In the Caucasians, it is sharp, and the silling is much more prominent over here. In the Mongoloids, it's much more rounded, and in the Negroids, there is no ridge or there is no guttering at all. So this is basically the characteristics of the guttering that are to be noted for the ancestral determination in any skull that we have found out. Now the prognathism. What is prognathism basically? It is when the jaw sticks out away from the face. So this basically characteristic of the skull, it is more prominent in the Negroids. Use a pencil from the nasal spine to the chin to determine. So this is basically how we determine. We use a pencil and it is kept from the nasal spine to the chin. So if it is sticking out, that means prognathism is present. And in the Caucasians, it is much straight. In the Mongoloids, it is variable. And in the Negroids, it is more prognatic. So prognathism is basically a characteristic of the Negroids. Now the shape of the orbital openings. Now the Negroids have a rectangular orbital opening. The Caucasians have a much more rounded or somewhat square opening. And whenever we are talking about the Mongoloids, it's much more rounded and somewhat circular opening for the orbits. The femoral indices are also important for the ancestral determination. It's a normal femur that is shown over here, and these are all the indices that basically comes into play: the femoral neck, the greater trochanter, and the angle that the femoral head makes with the lesser trochanter and the shaft of the femur is also very important. As well as for the sex determination of the human remains, and as well as the ancestral determination. Now what you have to basically do, there is a test. You have to lay the femur on the table, and the lesser trochanter is, we have to place the femur such that the lesser trochanter is closest to the table. And then what we'll do, we'll place a palm of our hand on the table and try to slide the fingers under the curvature of the shaft. If the hand fits in, the femur is of the Caucasian ancestry, and if the hand doesn't fit in and if it cannot be passed on, the bone is basically from the Negroid ancestry. So this was all for this section. It's basically how you basically map down whenever you have some bones on your hand, basically the skull, the femur, and how are you going to basically map down what ancestry these bones belong to. I hope you learned more about this ancestral determination. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.